This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Paula Moya is an associate professor of English at Stanford University whose research focuses on Chicana feminism, feminist theory, multicultural education, race and emotion, Latino literature and identity, and the epistemic significance of minority perspectives. She's the author of Learning from Experience, Minority Identities, Multicultural Struggles, and the co-editor of Reclaiming Identity, Realist Theory and the Predicament of Postmodernism, and Identity Politics Reconsidered. Excuse me, I should have more caffeine. She has served in a number of leadership roles at Stanford in the English department and at the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. She's been the faculty coordinator of several research networks, including one focused on feminist theory and how do identities matter. Professor Moya has also been a leader in the Future Minority Studies Research Project, which is an interinstitutional, interdisciplinary, and multi-generational research project facilitating focused and productive discussions about the democratizing role of minority identity and participation in a multicultural society. Since its inception, the Future Minority Studies Project has sponsored dozens of scholarly events, some of them here in Atlanta, actually at Spelman, and several ongoing research projects involving hundreds of scholars, ranging from undergraduates through presidents and provosts. As these activities demonstrate, Dr. Moya is a deeply committed to mentoring the next generation of scholars. She is also a warm and generous colleague who is held in great esteem by her peers. This was made clear to me personally a few years ago when Tyrone Foreman and I were at Stanford on fellowship. While personally Professor Moya could not have been more welcoming, we learned a great deal from her and her colleagues at the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity about what an invigorating intellectual community looked like and felt like. She's a dynamic and courageous scholar. As put by her colleague, Satya Mohanty, Paula Moya doesn't write about things because they would be professionally advantageous. She does it because the subjects jive with her personal and social values. She doesn't do things because they are popular. She does them because they are right. Join me in welcoming her here today.
Thank you, Amanda. So I get to be the first to say good afternoon. I'm really pleased to be here today. I was very excited to hear about the Race and Difference Initiative when I was contacted by Tyrone and Amanda, and to see what it is that you all are attempting to do. As far as I know, there's not a similar kind of effort in the academy where you're really trying to take race as a form of, as a system of distinction that separates people into groups, associates, differential value with them, and confers opportunity accordingly. To take race like that and to link it to other systems that divide people up in differently, but across which there are certain commonalities in the dynamics of how that happens. And it's an incredibly difficult task that you're facing. I have been affiliated for many years with the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. And there, of course, we really are looking at the study of race and ethnicity comparatively across groups. That's hard enough, not to mention that we do it interdisciplinary. That's really hard, too. As I sometimes tell people, and I think this is the case, that the more you work with people outside of your own discipline, the more you realize that in the academy at least, sometimes your disciplinary identity can trump your racial or ethnic identity. And so that's a really important thing to think about as you go about the business of figuring out who you're going to listen to, who you're going to pay attention to. And as Amanda also mentioned, I've been really involved with this group called the Future Minority Studies, which is probably much closer to what this effort is, except that it's not based at one campus. And coming here today, I thought about what I wanted to talk about, and it would certainly be fun for me to talk about the Future Minority Studies. I've had the opportunity to learn a tremendous amount of people who work on other forms of difference than what I work on, and have become friends with them, and I'm really happy to see a friend in the audience, Rosemary Garland-Thompson. But I decided instead, because Amanda said that one thing that she thought it wouldn't be bad to do is to talk about some aspect of our work that might be a little provocative or different, and so I thought I would talk about work that I've been doing lately. And the other reason is because I think it is an example of interdisciplinary work in process, like what it really means to do interdisciplinary work. As I'm an English professor, okay, so I'm going to be talking about things that I had to stretch to understand, and I also had to stretch to even be in conversation with the people that I had to be in conversation with to be able to do this work. So, so that's what I'm going to do, and without further ado, if I can figure out how to do this, I'm going to start my presentation. Okay, so in my talk today, I'm going to present one small part of a much larger project on race and ethnicity that I've completed really with the social psychologist Hazel Rose Marcus. Now, the project takes the form of an edited volume with 21 essays by leading scholars of race and ethnicity that are working in disciplines ranging from drama to biology. Now, building on the research of a wide range of scholars like yourselves across the world, so even though, I want to make the point that even though we've got 21 people in here, the point is, you know, you always have to draw on the research over the last, I don't know, 4 decades, really, that has been done on race and ethnicity. The book illuminates race and ethnicity as systems as ideas about human sameness and difference that become institutionalized through ongoing social practices and transactions. Now, Hazel and I have written an essay, a lead essay, that provides a framework to tie together the different concepts, theories, and examples presented in the individual essays. And the book, as you can see, is called Doing Race, 21 Essays for the 21st Century, and it's forthcoming from Norton in March. Now, the primary argument of the collection is that, contrary to what most people believe, race is not a thing, social construction or otherwise. Race is not a thing, it is an everyday doing. Race is a social transaction. It emerges in the interaction between different kinds of people over time, across space, and in all kinds of situations. And it emerges in the most minute and banal interactions that people have with each other. How you look at somebody, whether you decide to trust somebody, all the way to whether you decide to buy a house in a neighborhood because of you happen to see the color of their skin for 2 seconds. Now, my particular concern in this today, though, is with how recent advances in human genomic research is leading to the rebiologization of race. I began by giving a brief history of the modern concept of race before turning in some detail to what this rebiologization means for those of us who are scholars of race and ethnicity. And I'm going to conclude then by presenting the conception of race that Professor Marcus and I have been working on before giving our reconceptualized definitions of both ethnicity and race. Now, I know that this is a history that most of you know, but I think it's useful to run through it just to remind ourselves. So the dominant understanding of race today, which began to emerge in the 15th century in concert with the rise of modernity coloniality, holds that all people can be classified into distinct races based on inherited biological characteristics. Now, in the 17th century, we saw various efforts to settle on the number and the characteristics of the different races with various taxonomies proposed. However, it wasn't until the 18th and 19th century, with the publication of works by Carolus Linnaeus, right, Systema Naturae, Johann Blumenbach on the natural varieties of humankind, and Samuel Morton, Crania Americana, that the modern notion of race crystallized. Now, although the activity of noticing phenotypical and cultural differences between groups of humans has a much longer history, the modern concept of race can be distinguished really by these 3 claims. One, what happened here? Okay, sorry. I have the slides, okay. One, that race is a universal scheme that can accommodate all observed human differences. 2, that it is a scientifically based system of classification, and 3, that it is predictive about humans' differing capacities and characters. Now, the emergence of a race as a modern concept was thus fueled by the more general Western scientific project of trying to make sense of the world by classifying and ordering its subject matter, whether that subject matter be plants, animals, or humans, according to observable physical traits. Now, by the early 19th century, a scientific consensus had emerged regarding the existence of between about 4 and 5 distinct races that corresponding roughly to the different continents. Perhaps not surprisingly, the scientists who were doing the classifying found their own race to have the superior characteristics, right? So scientists like Linnaeus and Morton judged Europeanists, which they sometimes called Caucasian, to be the smartest, most moral, most attractive, and most culturally advanced race of the human species. And then, of course, after Charles Darwin published On the Origins of Species in 1859, his ideas about the way nature selects those traits and features that are most likely to survive were taken up by social Darwinists who concluded that Morton's and Linnaeus' racial group rankings simply must be a reflection of human evolutionary development. Then Gregor Mendel's laws of heredity, which were developed in the mid-1800s, were similarly enlisted by social scientists to support the belief that Europeans, and especially Northern Europeans, represented the epitome of human development. Francis Galton used Mendel's research to bolster his conviction, for instance, that intelligence was inherited. And Galton's eugenic program advocated restricting sexual relations and marriages between what he deemed to be superior and inferior races. Now, it really wasn't until the 20th century, then, that some scientists began to call into question the idea that cultural, linguistic, and behavioral differences among people were the result of a set of inherent and fixed physical characteristics. So one of the most important figures in promoting a new understanding of race, of course, was Franz Boas, the father of modern anthropology. Now, as a result of his research, Boas rejected the existence of a racial or ethnic hierarchy in which some groups are more evolved than others, and became a forceful proponent of cultural pluralism, which held that there are a number of equally evolved and viable human cultures. So after World War II, conversations about race in the United States continued to change in the direction of rejecting innate human differences, or innate racial differences. Americans' awareness of the horrors of Nazi genocide further contributed to this shift. And it was at this point that many scholars switched from thinking about race and talking about race, and partly because this term got associated with Nazis and the racial genocide, to talking about ethnicity. And that's really when the term ethnicity came into broad use. Now, of course, the switch from talking about race to talking about ethnicity really did not signal an end to the activity of racing difference, nor did it mean that suddenly all people considered all others to be truly equal. We only have to look at the impact of the Moynihan report about attitudes about African Americans in the United States following the passage of the Civil Rights Bill to see that the rhetoric of culture can be used as another way to race people. And this, to some extent, we might think about this in the terms of rhetoric and what word we use. Words are used by many different people to mean different things, and there's no one pure or right term that we can use. All right, so now, given the remarkable history of the concept of race, and as we can see, its impressive capacity to adjust to changing circumstances, both historical and socioeconomic, we should not be surprised that ideas and conversations about race continue to evolve in the present day. As the claims of 19th century racism were disproved in the second half of the 20th century by scholars like Stephen Jay Gould in Mismeasure of Man, and Richard Lewontin, Not in Our Genes, the idea that race had no biological basis kind of gradually gained acceptance within some sectors of American society, if not in the American public at large. Even so, the idea of race as something innate to the person or the group has never completely left us. The 2007 remarks by Nobel Prize winner James Watson, who of course was one of the discoverers of the double helix structure of DNA, are a case in point. You'll remember that Watson noted that he was inherently gloomy about the prospect of Africa because, quote, all our social policies are based on the fact that their intelligence is the same as ours, whereas all the testing says not really. He added that while many of us have a natural desire to believe that all humans should be equal, quote, people who have to deal with black employees find this is not true. Now, so Watson, of course, was strongly criticized and he apologized for his remarks. Nevertheless, the fact that a highly respected and accomplished scientist would make this kind of statement shows that confusion about race, what it is and what it means, is still frighteningly widespread. And so this is kind of the context in which I think sometimes in the academy, and certainly within the humanities, we tend to act as if everybody has moved to thinking that race is no longer biological. And I think we really need to confront the fact that a lot of people still really believe it's quite biological. And what are we going to do about that? The ability of scientists to study DNA sequencing, moreover, has had at least one unfortunate consequence, the rebiologization of race. Recent developments in population genetics now allow scientists to determine, with a very high degree of accuracy, the continental origins of an individual's recent ancestors. Or more or less, I guess a better way to say this is sort of the continent on which one's, within the last 100,000, 50 to 100,000 years, the continent on which your ancestors were likely to be evolving, right? So all of our ancestors evolved. They evolved on different continents. Okay. So in part because the racial classification systems developed in the 18th and 19th centuries were tied to continental origin, the newfound ability to determine on which continent an individual's ancestors evolved over the last 100,000 years has reinvigorated old ideas about the biological significance of racial difference. For example, DNA testing that gives people information about their genetic heritage has become increasingly available to the average consumer. Internet ads claim that with a simple, cheap swab and $199, you can find out about your past and, quote, who you really are. These new DNA testing techniques are exciting in a way, and they really have the potential to tell us a lot about the history of human migrations across the globe. Yet these techniques also reinforce the centuries-old notion that race is a biological entity that resides inside people's body or blood, and that it is, and furthermore, that it marks something significant about their characters or their behaviors. And I think this is one place that I am very critical, actually, of what Henry Louis Gates is doing, because by focusing on African Americans and then doing this DNA testing, he's completely representationally, cementing that kind of association. Okay, so I admit that it can be difficult at first to separate the fact that scientists can now tell on what continent your ancestors evolved, that's a fact, from the fiction that scientists are able to say, even to the point of breaking it down into percentages, what your biological race is. And in fact, several web-based businesses, genealogical societies, and even a few television specials, again, the Gates one, have capitalized on the powerful desire of Americans to find out who they are by discovering their ancestral roots. The fact is, though, that ancestry groups or populations and race are not the same thing. And that is really the thing that we need to sort of pull apart. Understanding the difference between ancestry group and population and race requires a clear examination of the relationship between these two concepts. So one of the contributors to the Doing Race volume is Marcus Feldman, and he is a professor of biology at Stanford and a principal researcher in the Human Genome Diversity Project. Now, in his contribution to the volume, Feldman indicates that current research on the human genome provides several important facts about biological diversity, and I'll just go through a few of them. First, all humans can trace their ancestry back to a common ancestor who lived in the part of the world that we now know as the continent of Africa. Second, approximately 100,000 years ago, one or more groups of people migrated out of Africa, with the great majority of humans who were then alive remaining there. Third, all the populations of humans that migrated over time onto continents other than Africa are descended in a serial fashion from these first groups of migrants. Okay. In other words, as some of the migrants settled along the way, some of their descendants pushed on east across what we now know as Europe and the Middle East and settled there. Eventually, smaller subsets of these people's descendants pushed on through what is now Russia and China, until even smaller subsets set off across the Bering Land Bridge into what is now known as America. Now you can see from this is a graphic actually from his essay that shows, I mean, there was some back and forth, but you can kind of see the general gist of the migrations. Now let me emphasize what I said earlier. The largest number of people who were alive when the migrations out of Africa started continued to live and evolve in Africa, or what we now know as Africa. It wasn't Africa then, it was just a place. Accordingly, the greatest amount of human genomic variation exists within the different populations of people who are descended from those who stayed in Africa, while the least amount of within population variation occurs among those people whose recent ancestors migrated the farthest from Africa into South America. And this brings us to the fourth fact indicated by current research. About 89% of human genomic variation occurs within populations of people, with at most 9% occurring between populations. So all of those things that we use to visually distinguish ourselves from other populations of people are one small, teeny-weeny little part of that 9%. The physiognomic differences are part of that difference. But that still means that the variation really is within populations. And this gets missed because people just think, that like, oh, I'm separate somehow in a way. Okay, so let's see. So any given human being is much more genetically similar to any other human being than he is different. What genomic variation does occur between himself and another human being is more likely to be found within his own population than without him. A fifth important fact about biological diversity is that it is not patterned in such a way that we can cleanly divide people into completely separate and unconnected populations according to either genetics or observable physical features. As previously noted, most genomic variation occurs within populations. Additionally, observable physical features such as skin color, hair texture, and limb shape actually vary continuously across geographic space. There are no obvious sets of features that anyone can definitively identify as characteristic of only this or that particular population. So if you say like dark skin, well, that varies, right? I mean, if you're going across it, dark, got light, got dark again, right? Or limb shape, anything. You can't just say, well, this is only people like this have this. So, for example, if you were to hike around the world observing different populations of people, you would see that the physical features we often use to assign racial group membership shade into one another in a way that is consistent with the migratory path of ancient humans out of Africa and across the globe. Okay, so even though humans cannot be divided up into completely separate populations, very recent advances in human genomic research have enabled scientists to identify genomic variations at the level of the single nucleotide, of which there are about 3 billion in the human genome. Okay, so that's, I mean, if you think about the tininess with which they can now make distinctions, it's incredible. The ability to detect incredibly minute differences at a level even smaller than the human gene means that scientists can now sort humans into non-discrete and overlapping, and I want to make that point, non-discrete and overlapping, but nevertheless identifiable clusters of people. In his essay, Feldman refers to these biogeographically based clusters as populations or ancestry groups. So that's what we mean by population or ancestry group. Now, an important thing to keep in mind when considering how the concept of ancestry group relates to the practice of human racial categorization is that depending on how fine scientists draw the distinctions and the specific criteria they use to divide the human species into smaller groups, researchers can identify anywhere from 5, and I mean 5 to 6,000 different human populations. So anywhere from 5 to 6,000. And my editor was like, do you mean 5,000 to 6,000? I'm like, no, 5 to 6,000. This is why the concept of ancestry group, even though it is based in biology, can also be said to be socially constructed, right? It's a socially constructed conceptual category. How fine to draw the distinctions, what criteria should be used, are finally social decisions made by people who participate in the larger societies of which they are part and who are subject to all the social pressures and common sense that are part of those societies. And so I wanted to show you a couple of pictures here. Now keep in mind that we're just talking about the 9% when we're looking at this. We're not talking about the whole thing. Okay, so you can, if you look over here, I don't know if you can read, but so in this HGDP data set, they have, I think, 53 different populations and so that they're listed here, and they start with San, Mobutu, Blaka, Yoruba, Mandinka, Bantu, Mozambique, Bedouin, Palestinian, and so on and so forth. So I'm less concerned that you identify any particular population. Then you can kind of see how it shades over, and you can start to see like differences. And you can also see that, say, in the Middle East, you've got a lot, you've got something that's common with people in Europe, but also common with people from Asia. And then there's this other orange thing there, right? And so, and what you find is that this corresponds both to linguistic diversity and to ancient trade routes. Okay, people go and they don't keep themselves to themselves, So, okay, so this here is a slide showing different biogeographical ancestry groupings where the ancestral group K equals 7. So somewhere along the way they decided, but here you have the same thing, but where K equals 6, 5, 4, 3, and 2. So you see, I mean, it kind of depends on how fine do you want to draw the distinction. Where do we decide? I mean, is it completely innocent if they decide to say, well, let's do K equals 6 or K equals 5? Because that kind of corresponds back to our idea about continents. What then do biogeographical ancestry groups have to do with the socio-historical concept of race? As my brief history of the modern and Western concept of race should have demonstrated, the idea of race has long been tied, in the way it has been understood and represented, to inherited biological difference. As I have noted, there was a period in the 20th century during which cultural critics, anthropologists, and other behavioral scientists interrupted that persistent association in order to highlight the role that ideas and practices play in the creation of different populations of people. But partly because both genetics and race are so poorly understood by most people in the United States, advances in population genetics have tended to reinforce in most people's minds the persistent association between race and biology. The resulting confusion really does pose a serious challenge for scholars of race and ethnicity who are interested in understanding the workings of race as a significant social identity category. So, the question that, when I was learning all of this from Feldman, and the question that you might be sitting in there is, so is race biological? And I can tell you this is what your students are thinking if you're not thinking it, right? I think at some level we have to confront what we're looking at. And I'd say on a scale of 1 to 10, and this is for me a kind of arbitrary number, you can argue with me. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being yes and 1 being no, the answer might be about a 2. It is true that humans are biological beings. Moreover, it is clear that some aspects of physical appearance that traditionally have been used to assign racial group membership, including skin color, hair texture, and limb shape, are biologically inherited. These aspects of a person's physical appearance are part of what make up her phenotype, the measurable or observable features of her organism. However, a person's phenotype does not derive in a clear or obvious way from her genotype, all the genes that are present in her organism. Other environmental factors, such as the availability and quality of food, cultural ideas and practices, and the presence or absence of stress, trauma, disease, or environmental pollution, all interact with her genotype to make up what other people might observe or measure as her phenotype. Furthermore, non-visible biological traits, such as blood factors or enzymes, that vary independently of visible physical features also contribute to an individual's phenotype. What this means is that phenotypic features that are sometimes assumed to be racial characteristics, such as a person's height or whether they have sickle cell, the gene for sickle cell anemia, right? Those are assumed to be racial. They may have something to do with biological ancestry, but they also may be greatly affected or even caused by diet, social expectations, and behaviors, or some other environmental factor that is completely independent of the continental origins of a person's recent ancestors. In other words, how race comes into being in a particular socioeconomic and historical context has a lot more to do with that context than it does with visible human biological difference. Okay. Finally, race differs from biogeographical ancestry groups in that race as a social concept is just a lot more complicated, has a much longer history, is far less connected to human biological difference, and comes loaded with a great deal of ideological baggage. Consider this. If a man has blue eyes and blonde hair, and if he's successful according to some standard measure of our society, then many people will probably assume that the same genes that produced his blue eyes and blonde hair are also responsible for producing the specific behavioral and intellectual characteristics that made him successful. This is the fallacy of biological thinking, and in general, and of racialist thinking in particular. We see the man's pale skin and blue eyes, and we know that they are biologically caused. Then we observe his material success and assume that it is similarly biologically caused. We conclude mistakenly that everything a person is or becomes is a direct result of his or her racial identity. The fallacy of biological thinking is why people make a mistake if they look exclusively to a person's genotype for answers to their questions about differences in people's behaviors or capacities. The human genotype simply does not have all the answers to the kinds of questions that about individuals and societies that we want to ask. So examining the origins, associations, and uses of the concept of race helps us to understand why United States Americans commonly think of race as a thing, and in particular, a biological thing. Moreover, as I have mentioned, the recent ability of scientists to pinpoint the continents of origin of individuals' recent ancestors contributes to a general impression that race is just biological. This is the new reality that those of us who study race and ethnicity, as well as those of us who are downwardly constituted by race and ethnicity, have to contend with. Consequently, it's really not adequate for scholars, and here I'm talking to humanists in particular, to assert that race is socially constructed and then act like we have done with the problem. Instead, we need to seriously grapple with the way race is realized in connection, however tenuous, with human biological difference. How, that is, race emerges over time and across space in the most minute and even banal interactions that people who are phenotypically or culturally different have with each other. So despite the fact that race and ethnicity are realized in connection with visible human difference, they are not, neither of them are something that can be located in our genes or examined in isolation from the environmental factors around it. Rather, race is an authoritative system of ideas and practices that takes shape within and helps shape the environments from which it emerges. And so I'm going to show you just, Hazel Marcus, my co-author, co-editor, and I came up with these little graphics, mostly for our students, but just to make it clear exactly. This is how most people think of race, right? So you have something inside you. Let's say you're a dot here, you're a dot person. You're a dot person because you have dots inside you, or you're a star person or whatever. And maybe if you have stars and triangles, then you're a mixed star triangle. That's how people think of it, and that's really how the discourse of mixed race works. Now I'm going to show you another graphic that we're trying to think about race as a doing. Now here you see that you don't have that inside you, but you see how we're mutually constituted by how we interact and treat each other. That it's, the person in the middle becomes a dot person in a way because of his or her interactions with family, friends, schooling, sort of make him or her into a dot person. And it's a two-way process, right? So even if we resist it, we're helping to shape the meanings of what it means to be this or that or the other kind of person. And so what we're, and part of the reason why we have these rings going out is that we're trying to represent the social context that really creates race. And the larger rings as you go out really start to represent the formalized laws, institutions, medias, as well as just shared ideas about what it means to be a dot person or a star person or something. Okay, so what I want to do, and I guess the point making is that none of us live outside the web of relationships that create and maintain race and ethnicity. And one thing I should say this, I'm assuming you probably all understand this, but I was giving this talk actually in Germany, and I had to give portions of this talk twice before I realized what somebody was asking me, because the questioner was thinking that what I meant by this was that white people do race to people of color. And yeah, that's true. But we also do race. We do it to ourselves, we do it to each other. It's a constant process that we're all involved in. None of us are separate from it. And the sooner that we start to understand our own implication in this daily process, the sooner we can start to really think about the practices that we're engaged in and how we might want to change those. Okay, so what I want to do now is just outline two different social processes, one negative and one positive, that are commonly associated with the terms race and ethnicity. Now, for the sake of analytical clarity, Hazel Marcus and I call the negative process doing race and the positive process doing ethnicity. In actual practice, however, the distinction between these two processes and between the two terms is much muddier. Under certain conditions, the term ethnicity can be associated with negative consequences, and this is the case, for instance, in Europe, where they really don't use the word race. They use the term ethnicity, but they mean by it more or less what we mean by race. And besides that, in some situations, the processes overlap. So what we're really trying to do is, if we say race is a doing, it's like, well, so what do you mean by that? Well, this is what we mean. Okay. So race, okay, so it's not a thing. Race is a doing. It is a dynamic system of historically derived and institutional ideas and practices that sorts people into ethnic groups according to perceived, and that's a very important point, perceived physical and behavioral human characteristics that are often imagined to be negative, innate, and shared. It then associates differential value, power, and privilege with these characteristics, establishes a hierarchy among the different groups, and confers opportunity accordingly. And it emerges, either or both, when groups are perceived to pose a threat, political, economic, or cultural, to each other's worldview or way of life, and or to justify the denigration and exploitation, past, current, or future, of other groups while exalting one's own group to claim an innate privilege. And so I would say that a lot of the discourse around undocumented immigrants right now is a doing of race that in some ways is set to secure the future exploitation of a whole bunch of people. Like they don't deserve basic services because they're just, people outside the realm. Okay, so this is a negative process, and what I want to focus on is that this process goes on whether you call it race or ethnicity or something altogether different. It's the process that we're interested in more than the name. Okay, so here's another process, and we were pushed to come up with this because, so we're doing our thing and we're like wanting to talk about race, and our students kept saying, well, what about ethnicity? What about ethnicity? And somebody calling us? I think so. They're telling me, you've talked for too long, Paula. I'm almost done. Okay. All right, so ethnicity is also, and again, this is the positive process. In some times, people use this positive process with respect to race, when they claim their racial identity in a positive way. Okay, so ethnicity is also doing a dynamic system of historically derived and institutionalized ideas and practices that allows people to identify with groupings of people on the basis of presumed and usually claimed commonalities, including several of the following: language, history, nation or region of origin, customs, religion, names, physical appearance, and or ancestry group. When claimed, confers a sense of belonging, pride, and motivation. And this is what I mean, like, in the 1960s, Native American activists, claimed being American Indian, or Black Power claimed being blackness. That was in a sense a kind of doing of ethnicity, according to this. And it can be a source of collective and individual identity. Okay, so race then, to conclude, involves several often simultaneous actions. It involves noticing particular physical characteristics like skin color, hair color, eye shape. It assumes, assuming that those characteristics tell us something general and important, such as how intelligent or how hardworking or how conscientious a person is or has the capacity to be. And 3, participating in the maintenance and creation of social and economic structures that preserve a racial hierarchy in which people associated with one race are assumed to be superior to people associated with another. And 4, justifying or rationalizing the inequalities that result. So this is how we're seeing race, as this process that involves all of that. It's not a thing, it's something we do and gets all the way into the structures of our institutions. So the concept of, let me see, how am I doing on time? We need to, okay, so let me, I'll say that while the doing of race, this is important for us to realize that while the doing of race often involves people's individual attitudes, the perpetuation of racial inequality does not depend on people's attitudes. Very often people do race unknowingly and unintentionally just by participating in a world that comes prearranged according to certain racial categories. So we see the consequences of the fact that people in the US have done and continue to do race everywhere we look. So we can see the effects, for instance, of doing race when we observe that very few Black or Latino students in an integrated high school are in the college preparatory classes, or when we observe that the chances of being in poor health, having no insurance, dying young, or being incarcerated are much greater for those associated with a minority racial group. These are institutionalized patterns that reflect and perpetuate inequality. To the extent that we accept these arrangements of the world as natural or neutral and do not challenge to work or change them, we are responsible for perpetuating inequality. While we may not be actively attributing negative characteristics to individuals, consigning them to an inferior status and discriminating against them, which is kind of the standard definition of like being racist, then we are nonetheless part of a larger system that fosters racial injustice. So although we may not be racist, we are still involved in doing race. So all of this leads to what I see as one major task facing 21st centuries of scholars of race and ethnicity. We must figure out how best to convey the idea that race is not a biological thing that we have or that we are, but a social, historical, and philosophical process that builds on and exploits human visible difference. This will involve developing the language and creating the stories that help people understand race as something that people have done to each other for hundreds of years and are still doing. Human diversity, cultural and biological, is here to stay for as long as we are. Such diversity can be a good thing. I think it's the source of much of our ingenuity as well as much of our suffering as a species. This is why, if we really want to make a change, we need to figure out a way to interact, to do difference differently. And I'll end there.
I'm going to just start talking. Welcome to the panel on organizational work at Emory around race and difference. I'm presenting to, we're a group of people who are taking some of the ideas, the intellectual work of race and difference, and trying to deploy it in practical ways in communities both within and outside Emory. Each of us will speak again for about 15 minutes, and we'll then have time for questions. Our speaker today is Sam Marie Engel, Associate Director of Emory's Office of University and Community Partnerships. The OUCP, we have a lot of acronyms at Emory, the OUCP was created in 2000 by the Office of the Provost, and today is a thriving center and clearinghouse of information for those interested in integrating teaching and research. Sam Marie Engel came to Emory with extensive governmental and community experience. She served as Division Chief of Government Services at the Atlanta Regional Commission. As Associate Director of Research Atlanta, she developed televised forums on local public policy issues, one of which earned a Regional Emmy Award nomination. She received her BA from Emory, a Master's in Health Sciences from the University of Florida, and a Master's in Urban Studies and Nonprofit Administration from the Georgia State University.
I'm going to figure out how to get my PowerPoint presentation to come up. Yes. Do I make it full screen? Got the technology out of the way. As I said, I'm with the Office of University Community Partnerships, and we are one of 2 entities on campus that's charged with leading the Engaged Scholars Initiative. Our partners in that endeavor are Volunteer Emory and Campus Life. I wanted to just give you a little brief overview about how we approach our work, because race and difference isn't what we do, it's why we do what we do. And the fact that we work in the community, and so every issue that affects Metro Atlanta communities has at its heart issues of racism, classism, difference. So our job is to engage Emory faculty and students and staff in a continuum of what we call engaged learning, scholarship, and service. So students from the very beginning of their days here on campus would engage in volunteer service, largely through the gateway of Volunteer Emory, or if they're at Oxford, Volunteer Oxford. And Volunteer Emory collaborates with a number of other service-based organizations across the university to try to bring some cohesion and some coherence and connectivity to the volunteer service, and then to connect that with things that go on in the classroom. So engaged learning courses where students are doing something in the community where they're connecting what they're learning in the classroom with addressing an issue in a local community or in a broader issue of Metro Atlanta region, or maybe it's international. Then we want students to begin to get some more intensive learning, and that might be through our engaged scholars programs like our Community Building and Social Change Fellows program, or the Ethics and Servant Leadership program, where students are spending a whole summer or a semester doing some more intensive learning and addressing issues from a more of a research standpoint, or from a more professional or pre-professional standpoint. And then we hope that they will go on to do maybe an honors thesis or a doctoral dissertation where they're really connecting their intellectual knowledge with addressing a real community issue in real time. And I have to apologize if I keep stopping, or I just took some albuterol, so I have asthma, and it makes me shake a little bit. So that's a community issue too, asthma. Yay, Atlanta air. So the way that we do our work is we're a unit of the Office of the Provost, and we connect with these different parts of the university and then kind of bring a lens to what is it that communities need to have done with them and not for them. So what we're trying to get away from is the traditional view of, let's see the community as one big living laboratory and do all of our research on it and do all of our scholarship on it and publish, and we get really great reviews and we get to be promoted. But the community has no idea what happened from that research or how they take the knowledge and continue to use it even after you're gone. Or where did you go? Why did you go away when this thing was working so well? So we're trying to change that and really be kind of a conduit and a intermediary and continue to provide the support even after students are gone or faculty move on to the next project. This is just a quick overview of the kinds of resources that we have available. And I have several of my colleagues here, Viola Hartfield-Mendez, who is our brand new Director of Engaged Learning. So she is our primary liaison and resource for all of the faculty. And Harold McNairn's in the back of the room. He's the volunteer Emory coordinator. So if you have any ideas or suggestions about volunteer service projects or want to get involved in Emory Cares Day, which is our International Day of Service on November 14th, is that it? Or you have an idea about a service project, he's the man to go see. So this is just a little plug. If you hadn't heard last year, because you weren't here, you were on sabbatical or somewhere else, Emory has been recognized for its exemplary work with connecting scholarship and learning to community. And so at the beginning of this year, we were named by the Corporation for National and Community Service, which is a federal agency, as the presidential awardee for community service, which is the highest national honor any institution of higher education can receive. So that's because of all of you folks and all of our partners. Few quick examples of some work that we're doing and across-the-board partnerships that really address issues of race and ethnicity and difference. And one of those is our partnership with Segal Radio, which is a local nonprofit radio station that broadcasts in East African languages, the ones that you see here, as well as in English. And we partner with them on a project called Hear Me, which is health education via airwaves for and by refugees. So we're creating radio programs, or our students are and our faculty are, in partnership with the local refugee community, addressing health issues, and that's broadly defined, including access to care or health disparities, or how do you talk to a doctor when you don't speak English, how do you get an interpreter. This is just a quick graphic to show you how that partnership has grown over the years, from Emory helping Segal Radio acquire its nonprofit status, having law students do some pro bono legal programs on the radio station about how to, your tenants' rights, your rights as a parent when your kids are in school, things that folks didn't know because they were coming from another country. And then we partnered with them in getting a $225,000 grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation so that we can launch Hear Me. And we built a recording studio for Segal Radio out in Decatur, which is now available for anybody to use in the community, particularly for Emory faculty who want to kind of harness and focus their expertise on creating audio or multimedia pieces around particularly not just East African refugees, but all refugees in Metro Atlanta, and then bridging the difference between what we call the new African American community, our newcomers, and then the legacy African American community. And so we're partnering with WRFG Radio Free Georgia to create programs where you have these really interesting cross-generational and cross-cultural dialogues about what it means to be Black in America, with these very, very different viewpoints depending on where folks come from. So that's pretty exciting. Another program that we have is students engaged in Project Shine, students helping in naturalization in English. And so our students, either through their academic courses or as volunteers, go out and serve as coaches and mentors in ESL classes and U.S. citizenship preparation classes. Dr. Hartfield-Mendez was really helpful in getting that project launched and getting faculty to see, wow, if I'm teaching a course on American politics, wouldn't it be cool to have my students go out and tutor folks to help them become American citizens, since they have to learn all this stuff that we learned years ago, and if you were probably asked, you wouldn't remember. You know, like how many people are in the House of Representatives, and, you know, name all of the justices on the Supreme Court, and, you know, all of these things. And then you have to do it in a language that's not your first language, and probably a language you can't write in. So we're really excited about that one and how it's grown, and about the new opportunities. So again, if folks are interested in being a part of Project Shine, we're really excited to have you. And then the third project I wanted to highlight is the work we're doing in Neighborhood Planning Unit V. And if you're from Atlanta, you know that the city of Atlanta is divided into 26 different planning units, which comprise a bunch of neighborhoods, as a way for citizens to have a voice in how their communities were developed or revitalized, particularly revitalized, or how do you prevent things like, the interstate system plowing through your neighborhood and knocking down all the houses and the places where people grew up. So Neighborhood Planning Unit V is over by Turner Field, southeast Atlanta. And that neighborhood is of a particular focus for the Annie E. Casey Foundation, which is the foundation that was started by the founder of UPS and named after his mother. And UPS has its worldwide headquarters here in Atlanta. So they have a real particular interest in making Atlanta a really good place for people to live, work, and play. Well, Neighborhood Planning Unit V was a working class area that's gone into significant decline, and then there's been a lot of revitalization and property flipping and gentrification, and now a ton of foreclosures. But it's a real jewel of the community, and so there's a decision of how can the neighborhood revitalize from the inside out, not folks coming in and saying, wouldn't it be cool if your neighborhood looked like this? Or wouldn't it be great if these people lived there and those people didn't? And how about we knock all these buildings down and bring in something else? It's saying, how can we have an organic revitalization and renaissance and preserve what's already there? So a number of people at the university have been working with this initiative through Ethics and Servant Leadership Program, their summer internship program, the Environmental Studies Department, the Department of Political Science, the Office of University Community Partnerships, Emory's Place, even the business school, in helping one of the community-based organizations develop a communications plan, not a marketing plan, but how do we talk about ourselves? What kind of language makes sense for the people who are there? And then trying to come up with an idea of what they're calling the greening of the community. How can it be a green revitalization? And that's where Emory has a lot of expertise that they can share. And just a quick recap, if you missed it, some of the support that we can provide for faculty, which are in terms of mini grants, technical assistance, matchmaking. I always say my primary job is twofold. I'm a matchmaker and I write a lot of reports. So we have a lot of expertise. We can help folks apply for major grants, collaborate. We've been talking with the Race and Difference Initiative that there's really a lot of opportunities for synergy, and we've had several of you folks come in and serve as presenters, particularly on a program we just did 2 weeks ago. While the rest of the city was flooding, we were talking about property flipping and the foreclosure crisis and the banking crisis. And 70 folks came out to brave the elements, got on an ark, and came and listened and came away with some great new ideas. So that's what we do. That's who we are. And we'll have questions later. Thank you.
To you. So I'm Leslie Harris. I'm Associate Professor of History and African American Studies here at Emory. Been here about 14 years. And I'm going to talk today about an organization that I co-founded, the Transforming Community Project, which grew out of a moment in Emory's history, not the first moment of racial strife, but the one that I happen to be here for, and a number of people here happen to be here for. It was a year of conflict around racial diversity at Emory, really a full year, a very difficult year, between 2003 and 2004. And I won't right now go into all the details of what happened, but what emerged out of various conversations among faculty, staff, students, administrators during that year. Our president, James Wagner, had the shortest honeymoon in history. I think about 2 weeks after he came to campus, things kind of blew up. and he ended up being in a lot of conversations around this. Two things emerged out of that set of conflicts. One is that there was a real lack of knowledge about Emory's racial history, that people really didn't know anything about the history or even the current experiences that people in different settings were having. So staff had one experience of race at Emory, faculty another, students another, very little communication across those groups about that. There was also a related lack of ease in discussing these kinds of issues. And it was sort of surprising to me because, particularly in the circles that I was in and the classes I was teaching, as a specialist in African American history, I knew a lot of people who had a lot of knowledge about race, but somehow that knowledge, that intellectual knowledge, was not making its way into institutional pathways in the institute at Emory. The other thing that I would add to that emerged during a year of conversations was that the catalyst for change around issues of diversity is often by incident rather than by thoughtfulness, rather than by a process. And that year there were a lot of calls for change and a lot of discussions that were very heated but weren't very constructive because everybody was upset and mad at each other. So out of a series of meetings that were largely staff-directed initially, but that also involved staff and some students, there were a group of us that emerged that met over the course of a year, and I'm not sure how it happened, but somehow I, along with Catherine Manigault, who's no longer here, who was in the journalism department, we ended up constructing two documents that sort of tried to precipitate out what it seemed the needs were that people were discussing. One was a need just to have more dialogue about these issues, and the other was to try to excavate and make more public and more available knowledge about Emory's racial history, knowledge about current experiences, so that people could really begin to look directly at what was going on. My thought with the community dialogues was that through a process of engagement and conversation, people would become more comfortable in talking about these issues, but that we needed the sort of information, literal information about some of these things. And there are a couple of colleagues of mine who are still part of the TCP who are constantly saying, where's the data? We need the data. And I was like, ah. So that kind of pushed us in certain kinds of directions. To address those needs, two ideas emerged. One was to create dialogue groups, and the second was to excavate and publicize info about Emory's racial history and current experiences. As we were coming together with this idea, Earl Lewis arrived on campus, and I think about a day after he got here, I ran to him and said, I have this idea, I have these two ideas, what do you think about them? And at that point, we were rooted in the college, really. And he said, well, what about the whole university? And I said, okay. Which now seems very naive. And so we began to work on meeting with people all across campus the following year, 2004 to 2005. There were several key meetings, one in January that I remember, which I call the meeting of the 70, where actually in this room we met and had tape, I think George was there at that meeting, taped it and talked about what this emerging program was, and then we had a retreat down at Callaway Gardens over a weekend where 40 people, faculty, staff, and students came together, and some alums too, I think, came together to really work out what became the Transforming Community Project. The two main strands of the Transforming Community Project are, one, the Community Dialogue Program, in which faculty, staff, students, and alums meet over the course of 8 weeks around a set syllabus. And the second main strand is the Gathering the Tools group, which meets on a similar kind of schedule where we give historical tools, oral history, archival work, and other kinds of things, and teach people who are not the typical researchers how to research. Both of those groups are largely, the community dialogues have about 47–48% staff population, which is slightly overrepresentation of staff, and even more so in the Gathering the Tools. We have, I don't have the exact figures, but many more staff sign up for Gathering the Tools for those groups. Initially, when we were starting this work, we thought that undergraduate courses would be the engine of the excavation of the history at Emory. And so we also planned a faculty pedagogy seminar, which we still operate, which we have basically for 5 full days right at the end of the semester, where faculty can learn about Emory's history and think about incorporating it either into a new course or into an existing course, so that undergraduates, and we've had some people work with graduate students, can begin to excavate this history and then feed it back into the community dialogues. One thing that happened with that faculty pedagogy seminar in particular is that we were able to attain Ford Foundation support for that. As we were getting off the ground, the Ford Foundation initiated a Difficult Dialogues initiative, which was a response to, initially to rising Islamophobia post 9/11. We initially thought we wouldn't, as a kind of older problem, a more black-white problem, and then some other problems that got later on, we thought that we might not be eligible, but they've actually been extremely supportive and very excited about the work we've been doing. And so they funded us for an initial 2 years and then renewed our grant, and we're coming to the end of that grant. That grant supports our faculty pedagogy seminars. It also supports our 2 postdocs, one of whom is here, Andy Urban, and maybe if I have time, I'll talk a little bit more about him. I want to say a little bit about the name, the Transforming Community Project. It's a name that I kind of came up with, and it was a way to capture the fact that we all live in communities that are transforming, and certainly American higher education is constantly in a state of transformation. They're the small transformations of students coming to campus and leaving, or faculty, colleagues leaving, and the ways that institutions change. But there's also, of course, the larger transformation that we've all been a part of in the last 50 years. And so you can either be conscious of that transformation and try to actively shape it, or you can get whipped around by it. And so we want to encourage people to be activists about the transformation, to be considerate about it, to think through it, and to really think about it. There's a question that often came up in the first years of the project, which is when I would say I'm directing the Transforming Community Project at Emory, people say, oh, you mean out in Atlanta? And I said, no, we have Sam Marie and her colleagues at the Office of University Community Partnerships. But the other thing I would say about that is that universities tend to forget how large their shadow is, and individuals within universities. Emory is the largest, I believe, private employer in DeKalb County. And even beyond that, our shadow in Atlanta is huge, stated or unstated. And if we begin to transform our institution, we create a ripple effect. And so there's a way sometimes in which faculty, students, others, we think of community as out there, but we're part of an institution that has a huge impact on the community as well. Let's see. I want to talk a little bit about the community dialogues and just show you very quickly, if I can find it. We have a new, I may not be able to find it, never mind. No, sorry, we have a new website and I haven't fully figured out where everything is, or if we put everything back. As I said before, staff have been the majority of our participants, and one of the ways in which particularly, let me back up. The community dialogue is really the signature experience for most people who get involved with the project. And one of the things I want to say about that is one of the things we've worked very hard to do is really cross hierarchical lines and give people who are traditionally not seen as experts on these topics access to expertise and to leadership on their own. So another thing that people sometimes ask me when they hear about the community dialogues is, and that they're facilitated, they say, well, do you have faculty facilitating them? And I say, well, actually, no. Not always. We do have faculty facilitators, but we also have staff facilitators and student facilitators. So you can come into a community dialogue as a participant, and that is your gateway into becoming a facilitator once you've completed a participation and have recommendation from your own facilitator. This has created, I think, is beginning to have a ripple effect in terms of people really feeling, learning their own voice around these issues and expressing leadership, not only, of course, within the TCP itself, but also within the larger Emory community. The numbers that we have so far in terms of participation, we've had over 1,500 people participate in community dialogues and another 100 to 150 who've been facilitators. In terms of other programs that we do, annual events, and including, I think, the faculty pedagogy seminar, we've had between 1,500 and 2,000 people participate in those kind of one-time events. Actually, Troy Duster was someone who came to one of our early events here several years ago. Let me say a little bit about the gathering the tools process, because that's another way in which staff in particular have begun to find their own voices in the institution in a way that's somewhat different. As I said, the majority of participants in the Gathering the Tools group are staff members. And we've had a lot of people who've been interested in asking questions about Emory's racial history and trying to get them answered. It took us a little while to figure out how to make that happen. Supposedly I get paid to research myself, and certainly finding time to do my own research on top of everything else I do was difficult. It was even more so for some of the staff members who had really good questions, but who we really couldn't, we weren't able to get them into the library to do the things they do or get them to do the oral histories they wanted to do. So 2 summers ago, we created what we call faculty research we created TCP research triads, which are composed of a faculty mentor, a staff person with a question or idea, and a student who provides most of the archival or other kind of labor. Our first research triad was composed of a woman, Ellen Spears, who is no longer at Emory, who's a faculty member who's in environmental studies, Portia Allen, who is a staff member who is now actually in Africa, and a student, Iman Falayan, who is still here at Emory. Portia had a question about the first African students who had come to Emory, and Iman got very involved with that project and did the sort of looking through yearbooks and looking at registration cards to figure out who that person was, and then they've put together a series of exhibits and online things. Portia also then interviewed those who were still living who had been here from the 60s. And so that's a project that we anticipate will come to fullness in a couple of years. We also have a couple of projects that we're starting, one on the black nurses at Grady. There was a young woman in our tools group last year whose grandmother, I think it was her aunt or her great aunt, was one of the first black nurses at Grady. And I'm forgetting one other. The other people who will be involved besides undergraduates in providing some of the energy for research for our staff members will be our community research fellows. Andy Urban, who I mentioned, who's here, and also Melissa Sexton, who's not in the audience right now. Oh, you are there. Hi, thank you. Thanks. The final thing I want to say about where we're going in the future is that we got off the ground before Ozzie Harris was here as and before the establishment of the Office of Community and Diversity. So originally we were a 5-year project, and I was it's a 5-year project, and then I'm out. And then Ozzie came and said, really? Only 5 years? Do you think the race problem is going to be solved in 5 years? I don't think the race problem will ever be solved. So I said, well, it's not ever going to be solved. So I don't know, 5 years, 100 years, good luck to you. But Ozzie has graciously, gently, and persistently told me that we need to continue. And so one way that we are continuing, and I'm very appreciative of his guidance and mentorship in that way, one way that we're continuing is by continuing our work on race and continuing to excavate more work. I should also mention Bill Turner is someone who did a lot of work for us 2 years ago on the desegregation efforts that came out of Emory Law School. So we're going to continue that kind of work. The other way in which we're growing is to use this TCP model to investigate other forms of human difference. And that was part of the reason for my new website, which I still haven't learned my way around, but it does have this nice new text that talks about diversity more broadly. We have piloted this fall a dialogue on the Middle East to address some issues that were coming up on campus, particularly among undergrads, but not only among undergrads and faculty and others, around Israeli-Palestinian issues. We did that in partnership with the Office of Religious Life. In the spring, we're working, I assume it's still going forward, with the Center for Women. We're going to pilot a dialogue on gender, and in the fall of 2010, we're hoping to pilot a dialogue on sexuality. So we're going that way in terms of other forms of human difference. We're also hoping to think about moving this model beyond Emory. One idea that I've had since the beginning is that we started this at a particular kind of elite university. What would it be like to do it at a small liberal arts college, at a Georgia State or a UGA? What would happen to this kind of project there? So there's a possibility for some comparative work there. There's also the possibility of moving it out into the Atlanta community. This summer, I had an experience at the Auburn Avenue Library where I led a one-time dialogue, which was very interesting on a number of levels. For those of you who've ever been to an event at Auburn Avenue, nobody's shy about talking about things. But it made me think about one of the things with those one-off situations, particularly the anonymity, is that people just say anything. People walked out, people lost their minds. What if they're forced to stay with each other and know each other and work through some of the things that they were kind of yelling at each other about? The Ford Foundation has also asked us to hold a conference for higher education institutions in the nation to demonstrate the work that we have done and the potential for this kind of work on college campuses. And we have had one contact with a corporate a company, Equifax, and presented our ideas there as well. I'm going to stop there because I think I'm just about out of time, but I'll be happy to answer any questions. And I'll now introduce Ozzie, who's up next. As I said, Ozzie Harris came to Emory in 2007 as the university's first senior vice provost for community and diversity. Prior to being at Emory, he served as special assistant to the president and director of the Office of Institutional Equity at Dartmouth College. In his role as the Senior Vice Provost for Community and Diversity, he guides campus diversity projects, programs, and services, and directs policies that create a welcoming climate for faculty, staff, students, and visitors. Ozzie Harris earned his undergraduate degree at Dartmouth and his JD at Vermont Law School. And in addition to his work in higher education, he has worked with the Boston Human Rights Commission and with the New Hampshire Public Defender's Office.
Thank you, Leslie. And it's always nice to be told that we're not going to be able to finish dealing with race for at least 100 years. Because some days, that's actually hopeful. Some days it seems like 1,000. I actually never think of myself as a scholar, primarily because the people I know who do that work do it so well. But I do think of myself as an intellectual and a practitioner that's very interested in how we take ideas and operationalize them so that we create better access, equity, inclusion, and maybe, if we're lucky, transformation. And since I've been here at Emory, I've had a great fortune of working with a number of people that you know that are here in this room, faculty that are fully engaged with the Race and Difference Initiative, staff that are fully engaged with the TCP project, students, both graduate and undergraduate students. And so some of my remarks are more about how do we do what we're doing more effectively and actually recognize how difficult some of this work is. And so in listening to Keith Whalew's comments this morning and then thinking about a number of dialogue groups that I've been in over the last couple days, because Leslie was not available, I was told. Yeah, just so you know. I was just really reminded how our students conceive of race and other differences, and how those conceptions struck me as being so uninformed, and maybe even in many respects unexplored. And then it always gets me to then ask the question, who's teaching these students? Who's parenting these students? Who's advising these students? And so my guess is that that involves all of us, and that somehow both with the generations that are, I'm 51, that are above me, and for those of us that are kind of in between that group and maybe for young adults, it's clear to me that we've not been doing a particularly good job of talking about race, explaining its origins, its history, how it affects us, and many other differences. And so that's kind of a context for a little humorous story about the transmission of culture. And so I call it the turkey dinner story. I hope if you've heard it, you'll bear with me, and if you don't like it, you'll still kind of laugh. And it involves, I'll gender this person as a young man who's very proud of the fact that he knows how to make a really good turkey dinner. And it begins with cutting the turkey in half, as his mother always did, and he had watched her closely in the kitchen. And then, salting it, and then ultimately putting butter on it, putting it in the oven. And on this particular occasion, his parents come to the house to have this turkey dinner that he's particularly proud of because he knows that he has been following her directions all these years. And they are sitting down to have dinner, and she says to him, why did you cut the turkey in half? And he's kind of a little bit shocked and a little bit disturbed. He says, that's the family tradition. You always cut the turkey in half. And she responded, well, that's because my oven was so small. And so I was struck by Keith's comments about the flannel headwear, students thinking it could be some kind of Jewish cultural phenomenon or that it could be Southern. And I was reminded yet again that how we transmit knowledge and how we come to have an identity may or may not be really connected to the things that we perceive they're connected to. And this has been the struggle the last couple evenings, trying to understand how students perceive how they're raced, how they're sexed, how they're gendered, what those things are, why those things are important, what they know of history, what they know of their own cultural experience. And it's also led me to, as I maybe mentioned it for some of you earlier, to think about how they've actually commodified themselves in some fashion, especially many of the black students that I was talking to, since blackness has been kind of reduced to, whether or not you listen to hip hop, or whether or not you read, or whether or not you wear a particular style of dress. And I thought it's not connected to the racial experience that I understood about blackness at all. There was really very little conversation about the politics of what it means to be black, the history of blackness as it relates to slavery and disenfranchisement. So again, it just reminded me we have a lot of work to do, and that maybe some of the transformation that we can really work on is how we take our ideas past the personal and begin to think about adequately preparing ourselves and our students to think about how do we use these things to understand structures. So I try to operationalize some of these ideas here at Emory. I work very closely with many of you. I wouldn't be able to do any of this work without many of you being engaged in it. I've been here for about a little over 2 years now. The office that I inhabit did not exist before I arrived. Some people may wonder if it yet exists. But we're working very diligently to make that office central to thinking about some of these ideas and supporting others in the work here on campus, whether it's the TCP project or RDI or various offices that I have connection to because of reporting relationships, or the Johnson Institute. So the mission statement is there. I'm not going to read through it, but basically, we're very focused on this notion of access, equity, and inclusion. We try to use a model that really, again, forces us to think about engaged scholarship. Some of the work that Sam Engels was just referring to through OUCP, but it's not the only place on campus where it occurs, is particularly important in that effort because we would really like students, faculty, and staff to not just think about these ideas in an intellectual way, but to actually think about how these ideas can actually fuel transformation in a very practical way. And so some of you actually enjoy doing that. Some are much more theoretical. But my hope is that in many respects we can come together to talk about how do we address some of the problems that have been identified that many have spent a lifetime studying and trying to understand. I have 4 areas that report to me directly. Center for Women at Emory. This is a center that's a relatively mature center here on campus. There's a new director, and I'll let her introduce herself and explain what she does. But it's been helpful to be able to talk about the experience of women on campus, as well as to begin to maybe talk more fully about what gender may mean on campus. And I think, again, it gives me some opportunity to talk about sexuality, but not exclusively through the center, hopefully through some of our other offices too. And this is one of the ways that Emory has begun to kind of, again, operationalize its interest in access, equity, and inclusion. Equal opportunity programs. There hasn't been a lot of discussion today about representational diversity and what it may mean in higher education, what it may mean for you in your schools, departments, and your universities. But the office here on campus has some responsibility for helping us to think about how we hire, how we retain. This office has been a very hard-working office, but for both cultural reasons that are not the responsibility of the office, and and for fatigue has not been as effective as I would like over the last 10 or 15 years. But I'm hopeful that given Provost Lewis's interest and many of you being interested in these topics, that we'll be able to maybe institute and implement a renewed interest in hiring and retention, thinking about race and difference. And I think representational diversity is, I always describe it as foundational, but I also hope that we're able to think about it in terms of ideas in the curriculum and courses that we teach, not just the folk who inhabit those courses, but what are the intellectual ideas that we're trying to propagate, and do we have the capacity to make a decision not to hire our fifth European art historian, as opposed to maybe looking at an art historian examining the Pacific or Asia or Africa. So those kinds of conversations, which we will need all your support in as we move forward. Office of Disability Services, ODS, has been a strong office on campus from what I've been told, and certainly has been in the time that I've been here. Recently, that office was given some additional funds. We were able to hire an associate director with a great deal of experience and knowledge, and we're really lucky to have her here today. So, hi, Martha. And she's also somebody, like many in that office, that understand fully what intersectionality may mean, and maybe can help us as a campus, along with a number of noted scholars, to really lift up the question of how do we examine and think of ourselves in terms of disabilities and what it means to be able-bodied, or temporarily able-bodied for most of us. Office of University and Community Partnerships, Sam Engels has already discussed what they're trying to do, but I think that what I would really add is that office, for you faculty that have been involved with it, thank you. For faculty that have not yet thought of how you could develop courses or interact with that office more effectively, I think it's central to creating opportunities for students, primarily maybe graduate students too, to actually take ideas and put them to work. And I think while not everyone is maybe as practical as I am, I think it's essential in understanding what theories maybe actually are meaningful and what theories maybe are not so meaningful. So it's an opportunity for us to be able to engage with the city of Atlanta, actually do some good work there and learn some things that are good for us, and possibly put some ideas to good use, since we frequently want to talk about them. There are several advisory structures here on campus, again, that helped us to operationalize our aspirations. I won't go into detail with any of them, but the three of them are president's commissions. We've asked those commissions, much like ethnic studies and area studies, there's a great deal of self-interest that sometimes can be generated through structures that grew up in the 70s and 80s. I mentioned to this group of commissioners that we're in 2009, and we need structures that actually have a deep capacity to reach across boundaries to have us address some of the issues, since none of these issues are located in any of us in just one dimension or any parts of our community. Employee council is another area that I have a good opportunity to work with. And then we have two advisory committees that help me figure out maybe what I should say and what I should do so I don't piss too many people off. Several different diversity initiatives on campus. One of the things that we've really been trying to work with, and we've had a fair amount of energy behind, is the Community and Diversity Plan Initiative. I don't know if Alicia Sierra is still here. Hi, Alicia. Alicia works in the business school, and the business school, along with the law school, is kind of one of the early front runners. You've been doing your plan for about 5 years now, is that? Three? A little bit before I arrived. And we've tried to utilize these plans to help the deans and the schools conceptualize how they might operationalize their aspirations. So how they hire, what they do in terms of retention, what kind of courses they're developing within non-academic units, some of the same kinds of questions, but again, thinking about, are we friendly enough? Are we culturally sensitive enough? Are people receiving training and other kinds of things that would allow them to be more effective in their work? And certainly it's easy for professionals and staff on campus to imagine professional development We're also very excited about the work of Lori Patton and on the faculty side, focusing on faculty development and excellence. We also hope that faculty are concerned about how they enhance their abilities to teach in the classroom, not just simply topic matter, but how you organize the classroom so that the classroom itself does not inhibit students and others from being able to participate fully. And then maybe the thing that I've spoken a fair amount about on campus, that we actually have greater capacity to have courage in the classroom, so that we allow students to ask questions and we allow students to interact with each other more effectively and maybe even with us. And how do we do that and make certain that we have the skills that would allow us to do that? So Ken Hornbeck's also here. I'll mention that we've been working very hard on an Emory Facilitators Network. Ken, how many facilitators do we have on campus, roughly? I know I'm catching you off guard, so.
Well, depending on what you define, between 50 and 300.
50 and 300. So this is a little bit about like the construction of race, right? Between 5 and 6,000. But one of the things that Leslie alluded to is that we have incidents on campus where there are blow-ups and where people are frustrated with what's been said and how it's been said and what someone meant or what they perceive them to mean. And some of our energy has been really kind of directed towards developing a cadre of people on campus to have some enhanced or encouraged ability to help us resolve some of those conflicts before they fester too long and turn into a couch fire. I think additionally, it's just also another way of recognizing, people on campus who have been wonderful to this community by investing their time and energy. So we try to provide some opportunities for professional development. The We Are Emory initiative, it's been one of those things where sometimes it's superficial and sometimes it's actually very meaningful. But I think in this particular setting, it's particularly meaningful, even though it's not expensive for the institution to do. And we solicited from the deans and the various vice presidents of all the divisions and schools names of individuals who actually are community builders on campus. And we've taken those 100 individuals. We had, I think, 290 nominations, and we have 100 people that we are going to put on a poster, and that poster will be made in multiple copies and then distributed both openly and then directly to the people who are on it and the deans, to remind us that there are people on our campus who work every day to really make this place a really wonderful place. And some people will not be on the poster who do that too. But hopefully it's just a representation of all of the good work that many of us do to make our campus a place where we actually can kind of work, learn, and live, since we do all of those things. Number of diversity resources on campus. One of the things I've tried to do on campus since I arrived, and people have been working on these sorts of things since before I came here, is create more opportunity for collaboration and conversation. And you really have to thank the RDI faculty steering committee members for, again, creating a setting where many of us can come, listen to ideas, interact with one another, be renewed in our commitment, recognize that these things are the things we're discussing are so important to so many of us, and feel quite good about that, actually. It's a byproduct of all this work, Amanda, Tyrone, Leslie, Martha, Dorothy. So thank you. And then the other challenge in the work here is trying to figure out who gets credit for what, So this is, I think, much like the diagrams we saw around, how do we conceive of race, this diagram is how do we conceive of all of the people that are engaged in activity that support access, equity, and inclusion, and the various units. And so we haven't figured out a good way to represent that, but this was just simply an attempt. One of the people I work very closely with, who's very skilled and very wonderful man to work with, is Alex Christian. And so his hope is that he'll be able to design something like this, ultimately put it on our website, and actually it'll rotate. And all of these things will kind of move around. So again, we are reminded and we understand much more fully how many partners we actually have. And I think because we are a relatively large institution and relatively geographically dispersed, including having faculty and staff working in Midtown as well as down at the Grady Hospital, that sometimes we don't, it's very difficult for us to kind of conceptualize what Emory is, or we were just out at Oxford College, which is about 40 miles from here, on Monday. So, what is Emory? But this is just kind of our, a quick description of, there are many facets of what we're doing, and you do notice OUCP is there and whatnot, and our office is, but at the same time, we're hoping it can rotate so that no one gets some credit, all the time. So anyway, thanks, that's all I had to say.
Next up is Kalinda Lee, who is Associate Director for Research and Development of the James Weldon Johnson Institute. The Johnson Institute was founded in 2007 and is home to the Johnson Medal awarded to individuals who have excelled in areas in which Johnson distinguished himself. The Johnson Institute also fosters interdisciplinary research on the modern civil rights movement. Kalinda Lee received her graduate degree from Emory and returns here with extensive experience in academic and nonprofit administration and fundraising. She has held a faculty position at Loyola University in Chicago and has worked with the Albuquerque Museum, the Reginald Lewis Museum for African American Life and History, the African American Civil War Memorial. I could go on. She is also completing a book entitled Creating the Pleasant View, The Impact of Gender, Race, and Class on Suburbanization, which investigates the role that African Americans had on creating suburban identities and communities in the post-World War II era.
I never like these lecterns because I'm a shorty. I want to say first, before I even begin to talk about the James Weldon Johnson Institute, what brought me back to Emory, because I think that that's really telling in terms of what it is that the James Weldon Johnson Institute does. When I came through Emory, I should say, first of all, that the James Weldon Johnson Institute was founded in 2007. We had our first cohort of visiting scholars in our first real operational year in the 2008-2009 academic year. So we really are probably the newest initiative that's represented here. And having just celebrated my first anniversary in this position, I'm probably in some ways newest to this community in this capacity. But in some ways, as Leslie has indicated, I've been a member of this community as a student and then as an alum for quite some time now. And I came to Emory in 1996, having completed a master's at NYU, doing work in history and museum studies, and thinking very clearly that I was not going to end up working in academia. And having some really particular ideas about kind of these notions of the ivory tower and the lack of kind of applicability or relevance of academia to some of the social issues that I felt were kind of plaguing our communities. I came to Emory and earned a doctorate degree in the Graduate Institute of Liberal Arts because I was largely attracted to its public scholarship focus. And again, I had this sense that I wasn't going to end up in the academy. And as you have heard, I did in fact do lots of work and continue to consult with museums and some community organizations, and then subsequently ended up realizing that perhaps my life as a scholar could be meaningful in ways that I had been kind of too naive and perhaps arrogant to recognize earlier. But why I mention all of this is because I was at Loyola Chicago in the history department quite happily, and someone sent me an announcement about this job, and then someone else sent me an announcement about this job, and then someone else sent me an announcement about this job, and then a fourth person sent me an announcement about this job with a one-line note saying, "This is your job." And I was drawn to it because what I understood about the work of the James Weldon Johnson Institute, and more interestingly for me as an alumna of Emory University, what I was understanding about Emory was that there was a new culture developing here that was really about linking scholarship and praxis in ways that people had engaged and been discussing for quite some time, but that was really kind of institutionalizing in a very important way, and that this was a real opportunity for me to wed my scholarly interest with my kind of commitment to essentially service. And I think that really what we're talking about here in many ways is about service and about collaboration and about kind of redefining notions of expertise and leadership and what it means to build a community both within the walls of a university and beyond in that university shadow in order to make a meaningful difference for a community. So, having said that, as Leslie mentioned, the James Weldon Johnson Institute was founded in 2007. There was a planning year, and then in 2008, 2009, we opened our doors, really with the intention to honor the legacy of James Weldon Johnson. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him. For those of you who aren't, Johnson was really the quintessential interdisciplinary scholar. He was an educator, both at the secondary and university levels. Thank you. He was an artist. For those of you who are familiar, of course, with Lift Every Voice and Sing, he was the lyricist who penned that. He was an activist as the executive secretary of the NAACP, and a person who quite rightfully is in many circles most famous for his fight for the dire anti-lynching bill of 1921, which was never passed. He was a newspaper publisher, he was a writer, he was a diplomat. He was the interdisciplinary humanist. And really what our institute seeks to do is to foster scholarship, interdisciplinary, humanistic, and in some way social scientific scholarship that looks at the legacy of the modern civil rights movement, by which, for those historians in the room, I mean kind of post-Niagara movement, 1905 forward, and looks at the points of intersection between the civil rights movement as we know it as an African-American rights movement with the LBGT movement's struggles for civil and human rights, with women's rights struggles, and et cetera. What we're really trying to do here is to engage a scholarly practice and support scholarly practice that investigates both the history and the continuing relevance of civil and human rights struggles, and that also very clearly links human rights struggles across race and difference. So the mission of the James Weldon Johnson Institute is to foster new scholarship, teaching, and public dialogue that focuses upon the origins, evolutions, and legacy of the modern civil rights movement. The vision of the James Weldon Johnson Institute is an open but applied mind serving all mankind. And I think that, I'll say more about that in a second. And what we mean by serving all humankind is both that we foster kind of intellectual work, and that we also are very engaged in the process of social advocacy and understand that a university is a place where it's both appropriate and certainly appropriate and defensible to be engaged in the work of social advocacy, as so many people here have talked about. To actualize our goals, we first of all focus on scholarship. Bill Turner, who many of you all have seen, yeah, Phil's raising his hand again, is this year one of our visiting scholars. We host 3 visiting scholars each year with generous support really from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation as well as various units of the university. And we also have a UNCF Mellon faculty residency program. That's a kind of interesting attempt to bridge a gap between faculty members in United Negro College Fund institutions and major research institutions like Emory. So in this case, we have a relationship. It's not a fiduciary relationship, but it's a relationship where we provide space and access to resources, most especially through our special collections. In order to allow faculty members from UNCF institutions to do work here, to have sabbatical for a semester. For any of you all who might be at all familiar with those institutions, it is a rare thing indeed to get sabbatical. And it's really important for us, even though that scholarship does not directly serve Emory in terms of being able to say that it's something that we produced here, that faculty members produced here, to always be reaching out to other faculty members at UNCF institutions. So this year we are sponsoring a faculty member from Dillard University who will be here for a semester working on her work on the modern civil rights movement. Those scholars who are part of our Mellon faculty program actually just teach one semester, one course, and the rest of their time we really carefully protect for research and writing. And then we also host faculty seminars and colloquia. Each fellow who comes to our institution presents at one colloquium, usually in the fall. And what we're really focused on is building, again, as we've talked about, so many other people have talked about, building a community of scholars who can really inform each other's work in process. So what we don't do is have our fellows present their work at the end of their tenure here as kind of polished final work that they're about to publish, but instead we have them present very early in their tenure so that they can then receive feedback from Emory colleagues and help to inform other folks' work as well. We're really very interested in this process of collaboration. Beyond the scholarship of our visiting scholars, we are also interested in creating working groups. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit later about how this is done. But we are interested in creating working groups that would bring several experts in a field to Emory over the course of 2 years to convene and engage in a discussion about some subject that has particular relevance to the modern civil rights movement, and that would end at the end of those 2 years with a symposium or conference. And of course, because we're a new institute, this hasn't happened yet, but I'll give you an example of one of the working groups that we are kind of currently seeking funding for. We have applied to a foundation for funding, and are very hopeful that we'll get it, for a working group on the intersections between the modern civil rights movement and LGBT civil rights efforts. And if we receive that funding, we would have scholars come beginning next fall, once a semester, and then finally in the spring of 2011, there would be a conference that we would host with those scholars as well as activists in that field. We also, of course, support the scholarship of institute staff, like myself. And we have collaborations with other institutes and academic departments. So for example, the colloquium series that we host is hosted in collaboration with the Fox Institute for Humanistic Inquiry. And we also have public partnerships and public scholarships with institutions outside of Emory. This is really a crucial part of what we do. And one of the reasons that we wanted to be here and represented here is because we see all of these points of synergy. I hope that at this point in hearing what I'm saying this late in the program, you hear a lot of redundancy, quite frankly. The redundancy is exciting to me because I think it means that the leaders of the RDI project are on the right path, because it means that we're all kind of grasping for the same opportunities to really share in our efforts to not be redundant, but to create really important synergies. So for example, Donna in the Center for Women has met with my director, Rudolph Bird, and I to talk about the possibilities of partnering with an organization in this community called Men Stopping Violence, which is an anti-domestic violence institution that really engages in very practical training of men to kind of intervene in their relationships with other men, to address issues of patriarchy, which ultimately lead to violence against women and girls. While they're very engaged in that praxis and really have a wonderful record in terms of those relationships, they don't have a venue to really theorize about the kinds of issues that lead to violence against women and girls. That is something that we can do at this university. That's something that there are faculty members who are working on this very moment. And so by providing a venue for that, for them, we're obviously providing a service to them, but we also understand that they have expertise that's important for this community, where there's an incredible amount of violence against young women that we want to address and to have practical mechanisms to address that they can help us do. So there's this kind of important collaboration where we trade roles as experts and leaders. In addition to our scholarly objectives, we also have public programs. Our public programs have a somewhat different character than the public programs that have been discussed thus far. We have signature programs in the arts. Again, remember, Johnson was a lyricist. He was, I heard an interesting story that the very colorful Zora Neale Hurston used to refer to James Weldon Johnson as Sir Jim. And so for any of you all who are familiar kind of with his work and his persona, that makes a lot of sense. He was very much about both struggle and celebration. And so our signature programs in the arts include things like the Spring Concert Series, which we will soon launch, include the launch program of the James Weldon Johnson Institute, which some of you may have had the opportunity to attend last spring, which featured music as well as a kind of historical overview of what led Rudolf Bird to found this institute. And we also collaborate with other entities at Emory. Last spring, for example, we collaborated with the Office of Academic and Strategic Partnerships, as well as MARBLE, which is the Manuscripts, Archives, and Rare Books Library, the Special Collections Library here at Emory, to bring Alice Walker to Emory to do a public reading in Glen Memorial Sanctuary, but also to host a day-long symposium where scholars came together to discuss Walker's life and legacy, and to celebrate the opening of her archives at Emory University, because she has, for those of you who don't know, given the lion's share of her work to Emory University to be custodians of. And along with that opening of the archives, to have the opening of an exhibition that Rudolf Bird curated that celebrated the opening of the archives in Walker's life while she was here. So that sounds like a lot, because it really was a lot. It was an interesting week. But demonstrates the kinds of ways that we kind of pull together with other entities at Emory in order to create opportunities for a really meaningful exchange. And then we have partnerships with institutions outside of Emory. This rendering, this is a rendering of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. Some of you may know, and I say that it's a rendering because those of you all who are here in Atlanta probably know that the institution has not been constructed yet, although there are offices. The National Center for Civil and Human Rights is one of our institutional partners, and we've already begun the process of advising them with regards to historical interpretation for some of their exhibits and the kinds of collections that might be appropriate to show there. So again, there's this relationship not only between the Institute and these entities outside of Emory, but really importantly, a way that the Johnson Institute acts as a bridge between Emory as a large entity and some of these other institutions in the city and beyond. Okay. How we make this happen is clearly by understanding exactly what it is that we do and getting the word about that, and also avoiding redundancy but finding synergies with others' work. We have institutional support, and we also work with broad-based internal collaborations. And one thing that I kind of wanted to really highlight that others haven't talked about, but I think is kind of, in some ways, the elephant in the room, is that we do this by focusing on scholarship, programming, and administration. So in many ways, what our institute, and I would argue in some cases, from what I understand, many institutes at Emory are charged to do is to, in certain ways, operate like our own little mini nonprofits. So we really are engaged in ongoing efforts to write successful grants, which is why it's really important to reach out to people like OUCP, and also to be a resource for faculty members who are looking for grants in the kinds of areas that we work in. We apply, and this might be something that we could talk about in Q&A, a significant amount of attention to support from sponsors, both individual and corporate. And I think this is, well, that's 6 out of 7. There we go. Okay. So now I'm going to end with a pitch, right? Speaking of sponsorship, so for example, our major fundraiser, because our institute in fact does sponsor a fundraiser every year, which begin this year, is the James Weldon Johnson Medal Award ceremony. This is a ceremony that actually is funded entirely by sponsors outside of Emory University, because this year we have no program funding. So this is the kind of thing I think that is difficult sometimes to talk about, but I think that we also in our collaborations really need to talk about together and kind of combine our efforts to accomplish, because we have so much other important social advocacy and scholarship work to do. So this particular event will take place on November 4th at the Carter Center. You've got all your information there about who the award winners are, and they'll all be there making comments and receiving their medals. And also, I should say that I think the press release comes out on Monday, so you'll be the first to know about this special event. This is an event that's, like I said, funded by sponsors. Those sponsors are not all corporate. For example, the Office of University and Community Partnerships has been really pivotal in helping us to make this happen. So it's really, really all about kind of coming together in order to make these things happen. Alumni at Emory is doing the ticketing. And what we're really doing is linking scholarship and praxis in very meaningful ways to address difference and create change within this community. Thanks.
Our final speaker today is Donna Yarbrough, who is also just completing her first year as director of the Center for Women at Emory. Before coming to Emory, she was the director of the LGBT Center and a part-time faculty member in women's studies at Tufts University in Boston. Dr. Yarbrough received her PhD in English at the University of Virginia with specializations in gender, race, and sexuality. At Virginia, she was also the director of programs at the Women's Center, coordinator of the Hughes Leadership Network for Women of Color, and an award-winning teacher. As director of the Center for Women, she intends to focus on identifying and eliminating institutional barriers for women at Emory, cultivating a university culture of diversity, gender, equity, and inclusion, providing education on gender issues, and developing partnerships with community organizations focused on women.
Hello, you're still with us? I feel like we've been sitting here forever. How do I just want to turn this off. I don't have a PowerPoint, but it's okay. Thank you. I do have visual aids, though, actually, so you should have did these postcards go around? Okay, so, and then I have a little calendar, so I will be referring to this. Thank you to RDI for having me as part of this panel. I feel very honored. I want, as Leslie said, I've only been here for a year, so some of what I'm just kind of beginning to operationalize some of the things that I want to do with the Center for Women, and so some of what I'm talking about is kind of in process and some is future hope. So I guess I'll start out with a little bit about what I said I was going to do when I was hired, and what Ozzy and I talked about, when I came here, which was that I promised that I would bring both an intersectional and an interdisciplinary lens to the Center for Women, and that kind of comes out of my background and my scholarly work. As Leslie said again, did kind of look, my focus was American literature in the 20th century, and you can't really talk about that without talking about race, gender, sexuality, class. So that was kind of part of everything that I did. Two of my dissertation directors were Eric Lott and Rita Felsky, and for those of you who know them, Eric Lott's the big African-Americanist, really dealing with race, and Rita Felsky's a big gender feminist scholar, and so I kind of see my upbringing as a scholar as related to those two pieces particularly. When I interviewed for this job and talked about taking the job, Ozzy and I talked a lot about the fact that the center was part of the Office of Community and Diversity, and I talked to him a lot about that I didn't want to kind of sit in a silo talking about gender as if it's unconnected to all these other aspects of diversity, and that I really wanted to be part of the Office of Community and Diversity and be engaged in conversations about all aspects of diversity. And so that's what we're kind of working toward, I think. When I was at the University of Virginia as a graduate student, I became the program coordinator for the Center for Women, and one of the first things that I did was to create a mentoring program for women of color. And so it's just kind of another example of the, kind of bringing intersectionality in. And then I helped start their LGBT center at UVA as well, and then went on to direct an LGBT center. So just briefly at Tufts, there's a kind of center structure of 6 centers, and it looks kind of very silo-ish, and students always talk about self-segregation and how the centers contribute to that, because it's a women's center, international center, African American, Asian American, Latino, and international centers. But what students sometimes don't see is that we did actually work as a team on a lot of diversity issues, and so that model was really influential to me in thinking about myself as an administrator, because I was considered, my opinion was considered important, and I was part of conversations that were about, for example, lower retention rates for African American men, or various social justice leadership issues, or things that really crossed outside of the boundaries of an LGBT center director. So now I'm going to shift to kind of talking about Emory. Oh no. Oh, that's probably this. It's my cell phone. I was going to use it to the time, but now I guess I'm not going to do that. So does everybody recognize that sound? That's that cell phone next to computer sound. Or next to speaker sound. So this card kind of gives kind of a thumbnail of the direction that I'm hoping to move the center. Just to kind of go over it a little bit, I say that the Center for Women helps Emory provide the best possible environment for women as students, scholars, and employees. And I should say that most women's centers in the country are located within student life and really focus on students. So one of the great things about this center is that it's really looking at staff, faculty, students, the whole shebang. Promoting gender equity, providing resources and skill building, bringing faculty, students, practitioners, activists, and other learners together to examine gender issues and work toward ethical solutions. And again, that's that redundancy that a lot of us are doing similar things. So the shift is really more towards intersectionality, I hope, towards looking at gender as just one piece of the kind of the diversity landscape and intersecting landscape. I'm also trying to do a kind of a shift from thinking about women to thinking about gender, and because the center hasn't really done much with men over its history. It's really been kind of women-only space, and I'm trying to break that open a little bit, and the Men Stopping Violence Project, I think, is a good example of that, and certainly the women in the violence against women movement have been realizing for quite a while now that we're not going to stop violence against women unless we engage men in that process. So, and I think that's true of all gender issues. Another big idea for me is supporting gender scholarship and really translating it to a general audience. I always say the generally educated person, and also connecting the scholarship that we're doing on gender, which I find out more every day. We're doing amazing things at Emory, and often the Atlanta community and other parts of the world have no idea what we're doing. So I want to be someone who helps connect those things. The other is another key point, I think, is trying to move a little bit from promoting personal and individual development of women and shifting a little bit our lens a little bit more toward institutional change, which I think the center does a lot of programming about individual women's empowerment, but hasn't necessarily, I think, made a huge mark in the, changing the institution. And Ozzy's going to be helping me with that part. That's another connection to the university. Yeah. So I can't do it alone. So then you have kind of four areas of focus that I've kind of developed over the last year. The first is supporting academic scholarship, and I'm just going to talk about a few ways that we do those things, and particularly how they relate to some of the work that RDI is interested in doing, I hope in some of my examples. So for academic scholarship, we're doing a number of things. We actually this is such a simple idea, but we had our first women's faculty dinner last night. I hosted the first one at my house, and we just had 8 faculty women from, and almost every school of the university was represented, so very, wide variety of people. And, I just made pasta and, some gingerbread, and we sat around and talked. And it was amazing, actually. It was really incredible. And most of the women who came were doing gender kinds of work in different, in public health and nursing, et cetera, et cetera. And it was really kind of an amazing interdisciplinary moment. Another example of that is the Angela Davis event that we had for Women's History Month last year. This was a program that was the keynote for Women's History Month, but also part of RDI's Motherhood at the Intersection of Race and Class series that was really a collaboration of many, many different groups, and involved the Atlanta Consortium of Colleges and Universities, which is kind of a new group of people interested in diversity from schools across campus who were involved in this. But the center took the lead in bringing Angela Davis to Ebenezer Baptist Church. And the idea, which Ozzy had to kind of push me on a little bit, of not having her here at Emory, but actually putting her in the middle of Atlanta and making Emory faculty and students travel to her, was a little bit challenging, but also truly amazing. I mean, we had the largest number of people we've ever had, I think, for a Women's Center event. We filled Ebenezer. There were people, peeking through the glass, having to wait outside. The line started forming, I think, 4 hours before the talk. And it was, many people have remarked to me, and I think it's true, one of the most diverse audiences that any of us had ever been in. So you had people who did not have high school degrees, and then you had people with PhDs. You had people of all races, community people, university people, teenagers, 90-year-olds, and it was a not a moment of deep intellectual engagement in the sense of it was one of those one-shot programs, but I think the breadth of it was really wide and affected and covered a lot of people in Atlanta and at Emory. Other examples are, I've done a lot of work with, where's Sita? There she is. Institute for Developing Nations, the Violence and Vulnerability Project. I'm giving a paper there in November. So we're trying to connect to the academic part of the institution. The second thing is leadership development. So one of my real interests is moving women and all underrepresented groups through the pipeline in academia. As we know, if you just look at gender, women are the majority of undergraduates and kind of start falling off from there. So they're the 24% of full professors. And the progress that we're making now is not, the percentage at which we're hiring women right now is not going to make a huge dent in that 24%. So it's not just we got to wait for a lot of people to retire and then it's going to be great. We're only hiring at a rate of, is it 38, 34%, something like that. So big issues there. So we've worked on a number of partnerships with the President's Commission on the Status of Women, the Graduate School, and a group of graduate students called Graduate Advocates for Work-Life Balance to hold panels on work-life balance. So we help sponsor one for the humanities and one for the social, one for humanities and social science and one for the hard sciences. Panels of women who, mostly who had children, talking about how they manage that and are able to, be highly functioning scholars as well as parents. Okay. I got to move on. Okay, so I won't go into the other two, the education and global engagement. And I think I'll skip to, okay, I'm going to skip to a couple of, I guess, other ways that I'm beginning to move the center. I really liked Provost Lewis's idea of it's convening, deepening, institutionalizing, transforming, and I think that the center does a lot of convening and could work on the other three. So one thing is to have a deeper programs that provide a deeper engagement on gender issues. So the Men Stopping Violence Project is one example of that. And another one is that you meant the TCP project as well. So we're partnering with two of the groups represented at this table to do kind of at least semester long or kind of a long-term engagement with gender. And another one is thinking about how to get to the institutional change part. So Ozzy and I have talked a lot about questions about should the Center for Women be involved in university diversity planning, in helping schools develop their diversity plans, in the faculty hiring process, so being a consultant or working with EOP and other groups to look at underrepresented groups in the faculty. And looking at pipeline programs and what we're doing to again, look at underrepresented groups. And I think the answer to that is yes, that we are going to be involved in those things. So that's kind of our future. Okay.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.